The Dreamland Motel is a place where we're free to interpret reality and its secrets however we feel most comfortable. And tonight's topic? It might just be one of the strangest in all of ufology. Tonight, we're talking about people who claim to talk to aliens. Not just one-off encounters, not lights in the sky, but ongoing communication, relationships, dialogues, downloads. Now, let's be honest. It's unlikely that every person we're going to talk about tonight is legitimate. There could be frauds, there could be people suffering from delusion, and there may be others who are simply misunderstood, ahead of their time, or caught in the wrong time altogether. Rest assured, I'm not here to glorify the topic, or to fan the flames of possible insanity. The truth is, I don't talk to aliens, not knowingly anyway. I don't know what it feels like to receive a message from something non-human. I don't know what it sounds like, or how you would know it's not just your own mind echoing back at you. What I can do, however, is listen and share, without judgment, without filter, and without embedding any subtle opinion I may have formed along the way. Because you're the one checking in tonight. You're our guest, and you decide what's worth believing. And if you find value in this kind of content, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment down below. That's the best way to support our work here at the Dreamland Motel. I consider myself open-minded, but I try to reserve a little rationality too. So if I ask questions along the way that sound a little petty, or like I'm nitpicking, just know it's not coming from a place of cynicism. It's just me trying to tie off some of the logical loose ends in my head, trying to understand how these stories might fit into the greater tapestry of ufology as I've come to know it. So settle in, turn the lights down low, and if a voice answers back while you're listening, just know you're not alone. Not everyone waits to be contacted. Some go out into the dark, quiet, focused, listening, and call out first. When we talk about alien communication, our minds might jump to radio transmissions, physical sightings, or highly technological interfaces. But for many experiencers, contact doesn't come through metal or machines. It comes through the mind. Tonight's first category of communication is one of the most difficult to define, and perhaps the easiest to doubt. Telepathic and consciousness-initiated contact. Unlike physical encounters or captured signals, these experiences rely almost entirely on the experiencer's internal perception. Communication happens not through language, but through emotion, imagery, impression. There are no antennas, no microphones, only the mind, prepared and open. For believers, it's a testament to the power of consciousness. For skeptics, it's all too easy to dismiss. But regardless of belief, it's a mode of contact that many claim has changed their lives. There are far more people claiming to communicate with non-human intelligences this way than we could ever fit into a single episode. And in truth, Several of the individuals featured tonight deserve their own dedicated deep dives, and for the people that require them, those are on the way. For now, we begin under the stars. Dr. Stephen Greer. You love him or you hate him. Regardless of how you feel about him, we can't spend 2 hours talking about communication with aliens without mentioning probably the most well-known form of contact, CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, a protocol for initiating communication with extraterrestrials through focused consciousness. Dr. Greer is probably best known as the face of the Disclosure Project, and in Greer's worldview, contact isn't just something that happens to you. It's something that you can practice. Picture it. A desert night. A small group sits in a circle, meditating. A laser pointer traces across the sky, never directed at aircraft, only used to mark the group's position. Soft tones play through a speaker. Tones Greer claims are recordings of previous contact events. But none of that is the real mechanism of contact. The key is something he calls coherent thought sequencing. The idea that by visualizing the location of Earth, then the continent, then the precise coordinates of your position, and doing so with focused intent, your thoughts can serve as a kind of non-verbal invitation to beings beyond. CE5 is more than a hobby. It's framed as a form of spiritual activism. Practitioners consider it a kind of peaceful civilian diplomacy. Instead of waiting for governments to disclose what they know about extraterrestrials, they take the initiative, believing that through collective, sincere intent, we can reach out and establish contact ourselves. And sometimes, they say, something answers. One of the earliest CE5 experiences reported by Greer's team occurred in 1991. The group meditated, projected their thoughts, and watched the skies. In response, a UFO allegedly blinked its lights back at them. Synchronized, intentional. Since then, Greer has compiled thousands of hours of fieldwork and testimonies. Participants report everything from orbs of light to structured craft to sensations of presence during deep meditation. Whether any of these experiences offer verifiable proof is still debated. But to those involved, the experiences feel real and deeply moving. Greer claims that many of these beings are not strictly physical, but interdimensional or even light-based. Some exist outside of time as we know it. One of the most intriguing figures he mentions is a being named Bijou, allegedly from the Andromeda Galaxy. Bijou, Greer says, communicates not in words, but in dense packets of understanding. Downloads. Bijou's messages focus on unity, non-violence, readiness, and the idea that human thoughts and emotions are visible to more advanced beings, acting as either invitations or warnings. These messages, Greer says, aren't vague New Age sentiment. They're precise in their intent. According to him, the beings warn against militarization of space. They express concern over humanity's trajectory with nuclear weapons, ecological collapse, and artificial intelligence. And most notably, they ask us to come in peace, or not at all. Some of Greer's Disclosure Project witnesses support this claim. Army Sergeant Clifford Stone, for example, testified that the US government had encountered multiple extraterrestrial species, all of whom communicated telepathically. He described interactions where beings could not only send thoughts, but read them. To Greer, this supports the notion that consciousness is the universal language of interstellar communication. Communication not at the speed of light, but, as Greer says, at the speed of thought. While Greer offers a structured method, other voices in this space advocate for something more intuitive, less procedural, more personal. Alexis Brooks is one such voice. A journalist and experiencer researcher. Brooks doesn't teach a fixed protocol for contact. Instead, she talks about frequency matching, the idea that communication with non-human intelligences can happen when your consciousness is attuned to the right state. Think of it like tuning an old radio. The signal is there. You just have to find the right frequency. For Brooks, contact is about resonance. She believes that by cultivating a state of openness, clarity, and inner balance, individuals can become receptive to forms of communication that exist beyond our normal sensory bandwidth. She draws from years of metaphysical study, meditation practice, and interviews with experiencers to support this perspective. In her view, contact doesn't require any equipment, only intention. Many of the cases she's documented involve spontaneous telepathic messages, symbolic dreams, or emotional impressions that carry information not known to the experiencer beforehand. These messages often come with a distinct emotional or energetic quality, something that feels other and not self-generated. In some families, Brooks notes, these experiences seem to pass through generations, suggesting not just personal alignment, but possibly a genetic or spiritual predisposition. Her work invites a slightly different question. Why do they contact us? And what is it about certain individuals that draws them in? For Brooks, the answer may lie in consciousness itself, its frequency, its openness, its evolution. But whether through CE5 protocols or intuitive frequency matching, the same core challenge remains. How do you know it's real? In a field so deeply internal, distinguishing imagination from communication becomes the central dilemma, the string theory of the metaphysical. And by that, I mean as far as we know, it may even be unprovable. Greer's groups sometimes seek cross-validation. If multiple members receive the same image or sense the same presence during meditation, it's taken as possible evidence of an external contact. Others report synchronicities, flashes of light, pulses in the sky, or sudden bodily sensations coinciding with specific mental outreach. Experienced practitioners describe a kind of discernment that builds over time. Real contact, they say, carries a weight, a texture, that self-generated thoughts do not. But even they admit that doubt never fully disappears. And I think that's a healthy place to be. Maybe the very act of asking, "Is this me?" is what keeps us tethered to the truth. Still, whether real or imagined, these experiences often leave the experiencer changed. Meditation is an incredibly powerful tool, regardless of whether your intent is to contact beings from another galaxy or not. I can say from first-hand experience that meditation can induce a level of profundity that words really cannot describe. I've experienced emotions I've never experienced before or since. Emotions I had no idea I was capable of. Maybe that's the alien experience itself. Beyond regular consciousness, there appears to be a well of emotion that we can tap into. And the question becomes, does that well exist entirely in my mind? Or does it exist as part of some sort of universal tapestry that for some reason we're yet to understand, we have forgotten about? Maybe the very act of calling out to it is what makes us ready to hear something back. Some don't wait for lights to appear in the sky. They don't point lasers at stars or meditate in groups. They sit quietly, focus, close their eyes, and claim to see across space and time. In this chapter, we turn our attention to a different kind of communication. Communication so intriguing, it's attracted the attention of multiple intelligence agencies and branches of military for decades. Remote viewing. The ability to perceive places, objects, or even beings across vast distances with nothing but the mind. Once investigated by multiple top-secret programs, and now used by civilians, remote viewing suggests that information can be exchanged without technology. The man most associated with the birth of remote viewing is Ingo Swann, a psychic, artist, and researcher. Swann worked closely with researchers in the CIA's Project Stargate, a Cold War-era program investigating the use of psychic ability for intelligence gathering. One of Swann's most famous moments came in 1973, when he was tasked with psychically observing the planet Jupiter. At the time, much of Jupiter's structure was still a mystery. Swann described complex atmospheric phenomena, ring systems, and other features, some of which were only confirmed years later by NASA's Voyager 1. But Swann's most provocative account didn't involve Jupiter. It came in 1975, when he claimed to be recruited by a mysterious operative to psychically view the far side of the moon. What he saw there shook him. Towers, domes, machinery, lights, even humanoid beings. Swann described the structures as industrial, some kind of mining operation, and claimed that beings seemed to be aware of him. Two of them, he said, turned and pointed at him, as if they knew he was watching. That moment, more than any other, lingers in Swann's story. Remote viewing was meant to be a one-way street, a secret peek into places otherwise inaccessible. But what if it wasn't? What if the minds we reach out to can reach back? Swann's experience led him to believe that these beings, whoever they were, possessed psychic perception equal to and likely beyond our own. He theorized that perhaps this is why humanity never returned to the moon in earnest, that we had been warned off. Ingo Swann, of course, will receive his own full-length episode in time. And where he operated within government-adjacent secrecy, Courtney Brown chose to bring remote viewing into the public eye. A political scientist and founder of the Farsight Institute, Brown took the techniques of Project Stargate and applied them not to earthly military targets, but to extraterrestrial civilizations. In his 1996 book Cosmic Voyage, Brown described structured viewing sessions that led him to astonishing conclusions. That Mars had once been home to intelligent life, that the survivors of a planetary catastrophe had partnered with another species, the Greys, and that both had established underground bases here on Earth. Brown's remote viewers described structures, tunnels, technology. They perceived beings still alive in hidden places. And they didn't just see. They claimed to communicate. Brown describes moments where he felt he was being guided, as though the ETs were not only aware of his viewings, but gently leading him. In one session, he claimed to enter the mind of a Grey, experiencing its thoughts, emotions, and perceptions from the inside. The beings, he says, were telepathic by nature. No words, only shared awareness. Through continued sessions, Brown's team claimed to uncover an elaborate cosmic landscape, benevolent and malevolent factions, ancient interstellar alliances, and even a galactic federation, echoing narratives found across many contactee claims. Courtney has gone further than this. Through his remote viewing, he claims to have learned that Adam and Eve were architects of a genetic engineering project, and also that numerous Star Trek episodes were written with the assistance of aliens. That last part might sound completely wild, but there's more on that later. Some of this sounds fantastical. It is. But Brown insists these weren't dreams or stories. They were directly observed, using minds trained to see without eyes. Farsight's later projects have continued this work, with trained viewers exploring targets like alien bases on the Moon, the interior of spacecraft, and even historical events with alleged ET involvement. These sessions are conducted blind, with multiple viewers submitting data independently. When their reports align, Brown argues it's not coincidence, it's data. Of course, one of the biggest questions we can have when exploring this topic is how it's even possible. Remote viewing suggests that the mind is not confined to the brain, that consciousness may be non-local, able to reach across time and space. If that's true, then it's not just a tool, it's a channel, and in some cases, a doorway. Swan was clear. He felt noticed. Brown suggests the same, that the beings he observed may have been waiting for someone to look. What they saw, what they described, towers on the Moon, Greys underground, messages about unity and evolution, may be real, or it may be projection. But to the viewers, the experience was concrete, real enough to document, real enough to change their lives. And if even part of it is true, if we really can see them with nothing but our minds, then we have another conclusion to reach. If we can see them, they can see us. If CE5 is about sending an invitation, this next form of communication, is about becoming the vessel itself. Rather than reaching out through meditation and intention, some individuals claim to open themselves like a channel, allowing non-human intelligences to speak through them. No lasers, no field work, no group protocol, just a person, a presence, and a voice that isn't theirs. This is the world of channeling. Sometimes theatrical, sometimes uncanny, always controversial. Channelers enter altered states, light trance, full trance, or something in between, and claim to transmit messages from otherworldly beings, extraterrestrials, interdimensional entities, ancient councils, or even future versions of ourselves. Unlike CE5, which emphasizes intentional contact and structured interaction, channeling is passive reception. The contact initiates them. The channeler simply receives. Tonight, we focus on three of the most well-known voices in this space: Darrell Anker, Barbara Marciniak, and Phyllis V. Schlemmer. What unites them isn't just the delivery method, it's the depth and detail of what they claim to have been told. From cosmic federations and DNA upgrades to ancient councils that may have shaped history itself. Let's begin with the performer. Darrell Anker is the channel behind Bashar, a being he describes as an extraterrestrial entity from a parallel reality, part of a civilization living on a planet called Ssani. Anker has been channeling Bashar since the early 1980s, entering a trance state during live events, interviews, and private sessions. The transformation is stark. Anker's voice shifts into a rapid staccato delivery. His posture changes. Bashar speaks confidently, often with humour and intensity. The result is somewhere between a lecture, a performance, and a spiritual download. Bashar's teachings revolve around the nature of reality, parallel timelines, vibrational frequency, and personal empowerment. He outlines what he calls the 5 laws of creation, fundamental principles that guide the universe. 1. You exist. 2. Everything is here and now. 3. The one is all, and the all are one. 4. What you put out is what you get back. And 5. Everything changes, except for the first 4 laws. In Bashar's worldview, we are multidimensional beings navigating infinite versions of reality. By following our highest excitement, with zero insistence on outcome, we align with the version of Earth we prefer. Among his more striking claims is the idea that the species from Ssani are part human, created through genetic blending in a timeline where humanity evolved into a spacefaring civilization. In that version of events, Bashar is literally a future descendant of ours, reaching back to help us awaken. Whether you believe him or not, there's no denying that Bashar speaks with consistency, confidence, and a very polished delivery. Is he a being of higher consciousness, or a well-rehearsed archetype? The answer, as always, is left to the listener. Next, we have Barbara Marciniak, who began channeling in the late 1980s, claiming contact with a collective of beings from the Pleiades star system. These beings, she says, are not just alien, they're family, future versions of ourselves, returning to assist in a time of awakening. Her most well-known book, Bringers of the Dawn, outlines their core message. Humanity is undergoing a transformation. Our DNA, once tampered with or limited, is now being reactivated. The Pleiadians speak of 12-strand DNA, a return to our full potential, and the awakening of psychic and spiritual faculties long dormant. They also speak of Earth as a living library, a planet seeded with genetic and energetic knowledge, valuable not just to us, but to many beings across the cosmos. Humanity's emotions, creativity, and capacity for growth are seen as keys to unlocking this library. But we are not alone in this effort. Marciniak's transmissions also warn of opposing forces, what the Pleiadians call the Lizzies, reptilian entities with an interest in keeping humanity suppressed. The core conflict, they say, is not physical but vibrational. It is about choice, consciousness, direction. Their tone is warm, often humorous, occasionally scolding, but always focused on empowerment. Where Greer's beings seem external and observational, Marciniak's Pleiadians feel intimate. They claim to have a stake in our evolution, a shared destiny. And then we come to the Nine. Channeled by Phyllis V. Schlemmer, the Council of Nine present themselves not as extraterrestrials in ships, but as ancient overseers, not just older than us, older than civilization altogether. Schlemmer's sessions with the Nine took place over decades, in the presence of researchers, scientists, and even creative figures like Star Trek's creator Gene Roddenberry, who attended and asked questions. The Nine's spokesperson, an entity named Tom, claimed to have gone by many names in ancient Egyptian mythology: Tehuti, Atum. The Nine, Tom said, were not just visitors. They were the architects, the spiritual scaffolding behind human evolution. The messages given to Schlemmer's group were sweeping. Earth is a battleground for consciousness. There are 24 civilizations watching and assisting. Humanity is at a turning point. And most of all, we have free will. The Nine would not interfere, but they would advise. Tom's tone was ancient, paradoxical, and often riddled with metaphor. He would challenge, tease, or redirect questions in ways that forced the listener to think more deeply. To some, he was cryptic, and to others, divine. It's been said that Star Trek itself was shaped in part by these sessions, that the vision of a peaceful federation, of cooperation between species, was more than fiction. It was actually suggestion, seeding an idea, preparing us for something yet to come. And if that's true, then the Nine have already spoken to millions. In CE5, the practitioner tries to locate and welcome an external presence. But as we've now heard, in channeling, the presence arrives first, and uses the human as a vessel. It's not collective, it's singular, personal, and direct. Furthermore, in CE5, communication often remains ambiguous, confined to lights in the sky, emotional impressions, group synergy. In channeling, the being speaks clearly, with a name, a voice, and often a doctrine. That clarity is what makes it so powerful and so divisive. As with all forms of communication in this space, the question remains the same. Are these channelers delivering wisdom or performing it? Some doors you answer. Some doors you leave unlocked and tell your guests to let themselves in. And some doors are broken down entirely. Let's now drift into an altogether more ominous room. One without protocols or lasers, no group meditation beneath the stars. There are no invitations here, no structured method for making contact or channeling, only the raw, unfiltered weight of being found. This is the territory of the long-term experiencer, those whose lives have become entwined with something other. They didn't summon it, it arrived, and it stayed. The experiences they report are intimate, sometimes harrowing, and always life-altering. They don't just describe sightings, they describe relationships. Some would call it abduction, others might say divine appointment. But whatever the label, the result is the same. The line between self and visitor begins to blur, and the experiencer becomes something like a bridge, or maybe a warning sign. Whitley Strieber's journey begins with a scream. In December 1985, in a remote cabin in upstate New York, Strieber vanished from his bed in the dead of night. What followed was a shattered memory. Fragments of light, faces not quite human, pain, confusion, and the overwhelming sense that reality had been pulled out from under him like a tablecloth in a magic trick. Communion, published in 1987, was not just a personal account. It was a psychic rupture. The cover alone, that now iconic face with black, lidless eyes, became a modern hieroglyph for something people had seen, but never dared speak of. Strieber's story, full of fear and ambiguity, gave them permission. But the story didn't end there. Over the decades, in books like Transformation, The Secret School, and A New World, the fear gave way to something else. Not peace exactly, but a kind of acceptance, even affection. The visitors, he calls them that, never aliens, as if to preserve their mystery. They began to speak, not in words, but in impressions, synchronicities, dreams, moments of communion that seemed more spiritual than scientific. Strieber came to believe they were not invading, they were teaching, initiating, preparing. Among the messages he received, that the Earth is heading into ecological collapse, and only when we are at the edge will they appear in full. That humanity must cultivate something he calls a strong soul, a deep moral interior capable of facing the unknown without fear or violence. That the visitors themselves are seeking something in us. He believes they have lost their sense of wonder and are drawn to humans because we still carry it, fragile and luminous, like a candle in the dark. These aren't ideas Strieber arrived at easily. He suffered for them. He was ridiculed, ostracized, and haunted. But the deeper he leaned into the mystery, the more it began to look less like an invasion and more like an initiation. One that has nothing to do with ships in the sky and everything to do with what we are inside. He believes we are being asked to grow up, spiritually, morally, existentially, before the real conversation can begin. Whitley Strieber's accounts could probably fill multiple episodes. He will have his own dedicated episode in time. Now, we appropriately move on to Chris Bledsoe. His journey, although similar, feels different, warmer somehow, but no less strange. His story begins not with terror, but with light. In 2007, while standing by a riverbank in North Carolina, Chris encountered glowing orbs, 3 of them, that danced and hovered like living thought forms. He wasn't seeking contact. In truth, he was a man in pain, battling illness, financial ruin, and despair. But after that night, something changed. His illness, Crohn's disease, vanished. His life began to take on the texture of something enchanted. And then, she arrived. Bledsoe calls her the Lady. She's radiant, feminine, not like the cold greys of abduction lore, more like a presence out of scripture or myth. Bledsoe has compared her to the Virgin Mary, Hathor, Isis, not because he understands her, but because these are the only symbols we have that come close. The Lady comes with messages, not just for Chris, but for all of us. She warns of a future shaped by the reckless hands of those in power, that there are people actively trying to engineer the biblical end times. But she also speaks of hope, a celestial alignment due on Easter 2026, when the star Regulus will rise in the gaze of the Sphinx. On that day, she says, a new knowledge will arrive. She's shown him visions of war, of famine, of political and ecological turmoil, many of which have since come true. But always the thread is the same. Love is the answer, and awakening is the antidote to collapse. You may be forgiven for thinking that Chris Bledsoe is just another prophet in a long line of failed prophets. But Chris hasn't walked this path alone. His story has drawn the interest of people in high places. NASA engineers, former CIA officials, defense insiders. Some have visited him, worked alongside him, studied him and his orbs. Some have witnessed them for themselves. People I know. At least one intelligence official has told him, "You're the most important story in the world, and no one knows it." According to Chris, he isn't trying to build a movement. He's just trying to tell the truth, to share what he was given, and to live as a man under the weight of a beautiful burden. Strieber and Bledsoe, two men, two lives reshaped by contact that feels more like communion than communication. They aren't here to convince you. They're here to share, to carry the mystery as best they can. And what they carry isn't always easy. Their stories have cost them friendships, careers, and a certain kind of peace. But still, they speak. Not as prophets, not as victims, but as witnesses to something real, even if we don't have the words for it yet. You may not be ready to believe them, but at some point, you may have to be ready to at least hear them. Because the knock on the door doesn't always come with sound. And sometimes by the time you realize it, the visitors have already made it inside. There's a strange feeling that builds as these stories stack up. One by one, they arrive, voices from different decades, different lives, different methods. And yet something about them synchronizes. At first glance, it feels like evidence. But the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to hold. Maybe the similarity means they're all describing the same truth. Or maybe it means they've all read the same script. In the end, it does resemble religion, a deep inner conviction wrapped in mystery, something to respect, and something to be careful with. What unites these voices, however, isn't their certainty, it's proximity. Each one speaks of something pressing against the edge of our world. Not necessarily from the stars exactly, from elsewhere, or maybe within. They talk about intelligence that can enter your mind, not in words, but in something stranger, a feeling, something more fundamental, an emotion that isn't yours, a presence that shares your inner space. And this is not unique to ufology. The mystics know it. So do near-death experiencers. And maybe, if we're honest, so do we. That fleeting brush with the ineffable. That sense of being seen, known, and felt. Maybe that's what all of this is. Not aliens, not angels, just different masks worn by the same thing. Experience, consciousness, whatever lives behind the curtain. To quote my favourite thinker of all time, Alan Watts, the word person comes from the Latin word persona, which referred to the masks worn by actors in which sound would come through. The person is the mask, the role you're playing. And all your friends and relations and teachers are busy telling you who you are and what your role in life is. What Alan means here is that the thing we call a person, the very word we use to define ourselves, was never meant to describe who we really are. It's a mask, a role, nothing more than a sound coming through a painted mouthpiece. And when you realize that, it hits like a cosmic joke, that your whole personality might just be a costume, something you put on to move through the world. something that others helped you create. But if the mask isn't you, then who is? Maybe there's something behind it, the experience behind the actor, the awareness behind the eyes. And if that awareness is the same in you as it is in me, the same in every being that's ever wondered who or what they are, then the lines begin to blur. We're not our persons. We're the thing wearing them. And we've just forgotten that we've put them on. There's something touching in the messages these beings deliver, if that's what they are. They don't shout, they don't boast, they whisper. Be kind, be calm, be better. The world is delicate. Your heart matters. Grow up slowly. We're watching, but we're not rushing. The voices seem to treat us like children, not in a condescending way, but in the way a parent watches a child try to tie their shoelaces, resisting the urge to help, knowing that doing it themselves is the lesson. It reframes the question entirely. Why don't they land on the White House lawn? Maybe because they're not meant to. Not yet. And what is all of this, if not a kind of mirror? That's what's clearest now. That the phenomenon doesn't just show up. It reflects. It reflects our fears, our beliefs, indeed our limitations, and maybe even our potential. For some, that mirror gives birth to religion. For others, madness. But if it gives you gentleness, or empathy, or the courage to reflect on who you are, then maybe that's a journey worth going on. Maybe that's the point of all of this. Not to change the world overnight, but to change one person at a time. And if you were ever granted an answer, if you could ask just one question, you might ask simply, who am I to the universe? And somewhere far beyond the veil, or maybe just behind your own eyes, something might smile and whisper, you already know. Let's continue with our exploration. And fair warning, from here you could say we're about to dive off the deep end. But as I've already said tonight, you are the guest. You're the one that decides what you think. And if I'm being truly honest, at this point, at least for me, nothing is off the table. At the Dreamland Motel, the rooms don't always align. Some lead to memories, others to metaphors. But every so often, you come to a door that feels almost like a portal. A room humming with ancient myth, cosmic politics, and a voice that claims to speak on behalf of civilizations far beyond the stars. Tonight, that voice belongs to Elena Danan. She sits at the intersection of every contact modality we've heard about tonight. Like Whitley Strieber, she was taken. Like Dr. Greer, she speaks of telepathic communion. Like Bashar, she relays messages from off-world beings. And like Barbara Marciniak, she brings visions of galactic alliances and ancient gods. But Elena exists in her own category, because her story is a singular hybrid of abduction, rescue, and what she describes as a lifelong diplomatic relationship with an interstellar coalition known as the Galactic Federation of Worlds. And it all began when she was just 9 years old. I know. Stay with me here. She remembers it vividly, not as a dream, but as a fracture in the ordinary. One moment she was in her room, the next aboard a ship with tall greys surrounding her, preparing to conduct what she describes as a genetic or neurological procedure. Cold, clinical, terrifying. But then something changed. 2 humanoid beings entered, tall, blonde, calm in their presence, and in Elena's telling, they stopped the abduction mid-process. They weren't greys, they were something else entirely. One of them was named Thor Han Eredion, a Pleiadian officer, part of a mission to intervene and rescue human children being experimented on by the so-called Orion Nebu group. According to Elena, this moment not only saved her, it changed her forever. The Grey's implant was left in her body, but repurposed, modified by the Federation into a quantum communication device, a permanent line, not to a government or a religion, but to the stars. For decades, the line stayed quiet. She grew up, became an archaeologist, lived, loved, wandered the ruins of old worlds. But somewhere around 2020, the line allegedly reactivated. Thor Han returned, not in a beam of light or dramatic vision, but in her mind, a voice, a feeling, a knowing, with messages about what was coming, that humanity was on the verge of upheaval, that the shadow of the Greys and reptilians was lifting, that a war for Earth's future was underway, and she was being asked to help share what came next. And so, Elena Danaan began speaking. She describes the Galactic Federation of Worlds, or Ora Nataru Shari in its own language, as a millennia-old alliance formed in the aftermath of galactic wars. It was created to uphold peace and freedom across the stars, particularly in systems affected by tyranny or control. Headquartered aboard vast ships like the Excelsior, it's staffed by beings from countless worlds: Pleiadians, Syrians, Umites, Nor, and more, all united in shared principles. She says the Federation practices non-violence, only intervening when planetary sovereignty is threatened. They follow a kind of cosmic prime directive, unless survival is at stake. In her telling, Earth was one of those stakes. Elena claims that in recent decades, the Federation has disabled nuclear weapons, delivered blueprints for free energy technology to military insiders, and even met with high-ranking NATO officials to plan for a slow, controlled disclosure of their presence. But it doesn't stop there. The Federation, according to her, is not new to Earth. They were here long before us. In a sweeping cosmology, Elena Danaan threads her story back through time, connecting her off-world contacts with ancient Sumerian and Egyptian deities. In her narrative, the Sumerian god Enki is a real extraterrestrial geneticist who engineered early humans, inserting his own DNA into our lineage. His son, Thoth, later known as Quetzalcoatl, was responsible for the construction of Stonehenge, the spread of writing, and the seeding of the Mayan calendar. The so-called gods of old, not myths, she says. Colonists, teachers, star family. They taught us to build, to observe the stars, to encode memory in stone. And when they left, they promised to return. In her story, that promise is now being kept. The messages Elena relays from Thor Han and others carry a tone that's become familiar in this series. Humanity is at a crossroads. You are awakening. We cannot do this for you, but we will help where we can. The future is yours to decide, but know this: you are not alone. Like others we've heard, the beings she speaks with don't demand worship. They speak of free will, of emotional intelligence, of finding alignment with natural law and harmony. Some might call it New Age. Others would say it borders on science fiction. Here at the Dreamland Motel, we don't dismiss stories just because they come in strange wrapping. We listen. Perhaps the line between aliens and angels, between Thoth and Thor Han, between myth and memory, is in fact thinner than we imagine. And perhaps Elena's story, no matter how extraordinary, echoes something old. Is her story that much more implausible than talking to a burning bush, parting an ocean, walking on water, or ascending to heaven on a winged horse? Elena's story talks of truth embedded in the stone and blood of our past, something we've forgotten, but that's never stopped watching. You may not believe in the Galactic Federation, but in a world ruled by lies and locked doors, maybe the wildest stories are the ones worth paying attention to, especially when they remind us that we're part of something bigger. And for now, we sit with this message, but all the while, wonder who first carved those stars into the temple walls. Not all experiencers walk barefoot into starlight. Some are handed a uniform, a clearance level, and a mission they can't explain. Dan Sherman and Jordan Jozak didn't find the phenomenon. The phenomenon found them. Through recruitment, through bloodline, and through programs buried so deep in the black that even those who run them forget which part is real. This isn't the story of a vision in the desert. It's the story of two men, separated by time, but apparently not by design. Each one drafted into a quieter corner of the military-industrial complex. Each one taught how to listen for voices not of this world. Dan Sherman was a US Air Force electronic intelligence specialist stationed at Fort Meade in 1992, assigned to train at the NSA's intermediate ELINT school, a standard step for someone on the rise. But within weeks, Sherman was pulled from his normal duties and indoctrinated into a top-secret SCI-SBI level program involving direct telepathic contact with non-human intelligence. A program called Project Preserve Destiny. And according to Sherman, his inclusion wasn't random. Your mother, he was told, was visited by aliens in 1960. You were genetically managed to do this work. Sherman was born into this, raised for it. His life was shaped, step by step, by forces unseen. He later said that his very path into the Air Force, into ELINT, was part of a grooming process to prepare him for a singular task, to serve as an intuitive communicator for the Greys, whom he admits he never actually saw. Sherman was trained in what he understood to be an underground room in a nondescript building close to the NSA complex, Maryland. A windowless room, a console with no mouse. He was taught to manipulate sine waves and flatten signal lines with nothing but his mind. He was never told what the signals were, just to match them, receive them, I guess, in a way, synchronize with them. Upon what you could only describe as graduation, he was deployed, and while stationed overseas, he would operate officially from a van. Another screen, more silence, and just waiting for whatever came through. He would type what he eventually received. Emotionless, exact, isolated. The transmissions came from beings he nicknamed Spock and Bones. Telepathic exchanges. No speech, no interface. Sherman's ID string opened these sessions, a 5-digit code. Then came what he believed were location coordinates or identifiers. Later, intelligible phrases. This was a hierarchy of trust. The more you could receive, the more you were allowed to know. He asked if they had a god. The reply, "Your question answers itself." He asked about time. They didn't move through it. "We move around time," Bones said. He asked about human biology. They responded clinically. "You are water vessels. We have been here a very long time. We appear more often in your past than your present. Yes, we defecate differently." And then came something darker. Sherman began to suspect that some of the location strings, some of the identifiers, might be tied to abduction events. He received a transmission that simply read, "This one will not be harmed." That was when things changed. "I realized," he said, "that I was facilitating something I couldn't accept." He left the program, found a way out, and from that day forward, he was back in the dark, just like the rest of us. In 2025, a quiet revelation shook the modern disclosure world. A new buzzword hit the internet forums. Skywatcher. Led by Jake Barber, a pilot with a long history of involvement in classified programs and military contract work. Skywatcher is an organized attempt to invite and interface with NHI using a mix of dog whistle technology, an as yet unknown device that can produce some sort of effect allegedly perceptible and irresistible to ET craft, and individuals with enhanced psi or telepathic capacity. Among those individuals was Jordan Jozak. But like Sherman, Jordan's story doesn't begin with his activation. It begins with his childhood. inducted into GATE, the Gifted and Talented Education Program, at an early age. Quote, I was trained how to perform something we called thought projection, he wrote in 2024, to serve as a conduit for communication and information exchange from ages 12 to 14. If you've ever read Project Preserve Destiny, imagine accomplishing a similar task, but using only consciousness as the medium. He speaks of being taken to remote locations, like Sherman, given exercises with frequency waves and screen-based geometry, and trained to, quote, sustain psychic cohesion, a term that, even in his own writing, suggests controlled disassociation. One of his earliest programs involved learning how to mentally merge with another individual during astral projection, described as a preparatory exercise for multidimensional linguistic integration. If that sounds like a lot to you, you're not alone. Even Jordan has acknowledged the difficulty of communicating this work. It involves experiences that quite literally have no words to describe them. Similar to someone who has taken psychedelics, the experience may make complete sense as it happens, as your brain is opened and unfolded and is capable of interpreting extra dimensions. But back in regular consciousness, there's simply no frame of reference to contextualize this area of experience. And, just like Sherman, Jordan Jozak was never told the full truth, only that he was doing important work, only that he had a gift. Sherman and Jozak, different decades, different handlers, but the same arc. Both trained in classified settings, told they had innate gifts. Both subjected to signal exercises involving frequency waves and screen-based control protocols. Both claim to operate in a different plane of existence. Both were told that their abilities were selected, cultivated, and controlled by forces beyond public accountability. In many ways, Jordan's experience feels like the continuation, or perhaps the natural evolution, of the work Dan Sherman was carrying out decades earlier. While Jordan never learned the official name of the program he was part of, the parallels are difficult to dismiss. Both men describe operating within the same conceptual framework, covert communications, carried out under intense compartmentalization, using trained mental protocols. The specific goals may have varied, or as I said, evolved. The eras, the language, the technology, but the methodology remains disturbingly similar, and both men were selected, shaped, and deployed under systems they didn't fully understand. As for Project Preserve Destiny itself, it remains officially unconfirmed. But in 2024, a researcher named Noah Hiradek submitted a FOIA request to the US Air Force asking for any records related to the program. The response was curious. Rather than issuing a simple denial, the Air Force replied that the request should be directed to the National Security Agency because it fell, quote, under the purview of the NSA. If the program didn't exist, why would they know who it allegedly belongs to? Sometimes the most revealing answers come from the people who say they have none. I hope that in time, the truth behind Project Preserve Destiny will come to light. If it turns out to be legitimate, if even part of it is, it may represent the first verifiable layer of ufology that directly connects to something truly ontologically shocking. Not just lights in the sky, withheld technology, or claims whispered from the shadows, but an institutional framework tied to real names, places, clearances, and protocols. And further to this, a glimpse into the fundamental nature of reality, one that may be impossible to comprehend. For me at least, that would be a first. A moment where the abstract becomes real. And there's one more thing worth mentioning. Throughout Dan Sherman's story, there are hints, faint threads, of a warning. Something he says he was never fully told, only made to feel. A sense that humanity must prepare for something. Whatever it was, it disturbed him enough to question things. It's a topic for another night, maybe another room entirely. But if it's true, I can only hope we find that truth before it's too late. What if the universe is a mirror, and these voices are what reflect when we stare too long? It's strange what a year can do. Ask me 12 months ago what I thought was going on with this phenomenon, and I'd have answered with confidence. Aliens from another star system, travelling vast distances using unconventional propulsion, studying us, maybe even guiding us. That was the boundary. That was the shape of it. Anything beyond that, I'd have called fantasy. Then I started to listen. I mean really listen. Not just to the claims, but to the people. To Clint Weldon, to Eric Schlimmer, Dan Cleary, Birdie Jaworski, Pavel, Ramsey, Gerb. I started to hear the cracks in the consensus reality we've all agreed to live under. And, like water seeping through drywall, something started to give. American philosopher Terence McKenna once said, quote, "I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder. And finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Because eventually, people are going to say, what the hell is going on?" End quote. I think that's where I am now. Not enlightened, not convinced, just quiet. Because for possibly the first time, I don't have anything to say. More data needed. Across every chapter in this episode, from the whispers in the deserts to the satellite-linked minds in classified vans, something keeps emerging. The message. It's cloaked in different costumes. Different persona, if you will. Sometimes it's a glowing orb. Sometimes it's a woman in white. Sometimes it's a voice in the mind that simply won't shut off. But behind the theatre, there's something persistent. It speaks of peace. It warns of destruction. It calls us to awaken, and, in some cases, it just watches. It gets difficult, because if these messages are truly from the same source, or even from different sources plugged into the same universal broadcast, then we're forced to ask, what are we really in contact with? It no longer feels like a simple matter of us and them. It feels like consciousness. It feels like being handed a mirror and told to stare until you see past your own reflection and see the true reality. And so communication may not be the goal, but the test. What if that's it? What if the content of the message is irrelevant, and the very act of receiving it is the thing being studied? This is something Dan Sherman alluded to, the sense that his role wasn't to understand, but just to relay, that the information was for someone else, that he was a conduit in a circuit he couldn't see the outline of. And then there's Jordan Jozak, who, decades later, found himself operating under remarkably similar framework, using waveform manipulation, signal entrainment, intuitive impressions, all to facilitate what? I don't think either of them really knew. It's a disturbing parallel to identify. They were both inserted into something they didn't ask for. They didn't opt in. They didn't apply for the job. They were chosen, trained, and kept at a distance from any real sense of purpose. Is that communication, or is that obedience? Sherman has said repeatedly that his work was not just about communication, but about preparation, that a catastrophe of some kind was known to be coming, and that his role would be to receive vital information when the time came. As far as we know, he was not briefed on what that catastrophe was, but the implication hung in the air, like a broadcast he could almost hear. Jordan, too, spoke of directional influence, being seeded, as a child, into timelines that might offer hope. The difference being, perhaps, that Dan was tasked with receiving the signal, and Jordan with changing it. This is not a message in a bottle. It's a map etched in glass, but only visible under ultraviolet light. And if all of this is true, then another appropriate question arises. What does it say about our place in the equation? There's a paradox here that's hard to reconcile. If people like Dan and Jordan were born for this, genetically selected, psychologically moulded, where does that leave choice? It's tempting to say it undermines free will, but maybe we're misunderstanding free will entirely. What if free will isn't about choosing our path, but about how we walk it, the style with which we choose to walk into the future? We're all shaped by our upbringing, our culture, religions, our stories. But every now and then, someone steps off the path, not in rebellion or to reject it, but to see it from another angle. Maybe Jordan and Dan didn't have a choice in their selection, but they had a choice in their response. The most consistent message, regardless of whether it comes from orbs, mantids, Pleiadians, or flickers of thought in a darkened trailer, is this: be kind, take care of each other, wake up. It sounds so simple, almost too simple. It's not a scientific challenge, it's a moral one. As I've said before, the moment a message becomes a control mechanism, it stops being a message and starts being dogma. For the time being, we should listen, we should reflect, but we should never surrender our agency. Because in the end, the only voice that matters might be the one inside you. And so what does it all mean? That's the question, isn't it? Not just for me, but for all of us. I've spoken to enough people now to know that something is happening. Something real, something weird, and something undeniably important. But I don't know what it is, and I'm not going to pretend to. For now, I'm just standing in front of a crossroads. One path leads deeper into mystery, another loops back into comfort, and another descends into madness. And one, I hope, leads to the truth. I don't know which one to take, but I'm not in a rush. Because for the first time in my life, I'm ontologically shocked. Not terrified, not broken, just open. And when I stare into the void these voices come from, sometimes I get the feeling it's me staring back. Thank you for checking in. Tonight's stories were strange. Stranger still, perhaps, was the feeling they left behind. We've walked the corridors of contact, from silent transmissions in NSA trailers to the downloads from intergalactic federations. Maybe we've glimpsed something more, that the message has always been waiting, not in the sky, but lying dormant in our own minds, just waiting to be listened to. As always, if you enjoyed our journey, please consider liking and subscribing. You can leave the key on the nightstand in the morning. Sleep well, and remember, dear guest, check in and tune out.